So what's the Jewish holiday of revelation? Shavuot. Okay, so Shavuot is when we celebrate Matan Torah, the receiving of Torah, Seret HaDibrot at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai. And we celebrate that in a couple of months. But today is the first Shabbat after Rosh Chodesh Nissan. Pesach is coming in less than 2 weeks. Next week is Shabbat HaGadol, which means time to get ready, everybody, and clean those houses. And what's Pesach about? If it's not about revelation, what is it about? Redemption. So Pesach is the redemption holiday. It's about our exodus from Egypt, Yetziat Mitzrayim. But there is, I would suggest, a fundamental connection between these two Chagim. And I'm not the first one to suggest this, of course. Pesach is the moment of liberation from slavery in Egypt. And then we have 7 weeks, 49 days of wandering, passing through the Sea of Reeds, ending up in Sinai at Har Sinai at the moment of revelation at Shavuot. So from the moment of the Exodus to Shavuot, 50 days. So there's already a connection, but I want to suggest something deeper, and that is that Pesach is a holiday that offers a glimpse into how God's voice can be heard in the world. So Shavuot may be the what, but Pesach is the how. More than that, Pesach is the ultimate model for how inspiration and creativity come into the world. So what do we know about Passover? What are the requirements for a Seder? So we've got, so we're eating matzah, we're drinking wine, we're asking questions, right? And questioning is actually at the core of what the Seder is about, right? We have the 4 questions, or 1 question, 4 answers perhaps, but even much earlier than that, even in the Torah, right, v'higata lavincha, like this idea that we teach our children, when your child asks you on that day, you should explain a bunch of specific things about the Exodus and why it matters to us as a people. But of course, it's not just children. In the Talmud, in the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, we talk about how if 2 people are sitting together and they don't have anybody else at their Seder, it's just the 2 of them, what do? They ask each other questions. And if you're by yourself, let's say you're at some lonely outpost somewhere and you don't have anyone with you, what do? You ask yourself questions, okay? Or you ask questions of yourself, or you ask questions and wait for an answer, I'm not sure. But questioning is important. Pesach is fundamentally dialogical, even when it's monological, right? But that's not what we see in this week's parasha. As we begin kind of the first verses of Vayikra that we heard chanted so beautifully earlier. So it says, Vayikra el Moshe, Vayedaber Hashem elav, me'ohel moed lemor. So God called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when any of you present an offering of cattle to Hashem, you shall choose your offering from the herd or from the flock. So God speaks to Moshe. Moshe speaks to the people. Here are all the weird rituals, right? The korbanot, and as I was describing earlier. And what happens here is what happens also in the book of Exodus, with its description of Sinai. So there we have the moment where the people are gathering for the first time at the foot of Mount Sinai, and Moses goes up the mountain and then comes down from the mountain. We'll sort of skip the middle part where he comes down and there was the whole thing with the calf, but essentially he goes up and he comes down, and then there is a distribution of the information that he's received. And there seems to be kind of this game of telephone where Moses is up on the mountain and maybe some of the leaders are in the middle of the mountain and the people are at the bottom of the mountain. But either way, Moses is there, and then he comes back and he may convey this to Aaron, and Aaron conveys it to the people. But we've got this hierarchy of revelation that's there. And this makes sense because, lest we forget, this is where the people are geographically still. So in our Parsha, when it says, Vayikra el Moshe v'daber Hashem elav, that God calls out and speaks to Moses, right? Where are we geographically? We are still at Mount Sinai. Sometimes we forget this, that the entire book of Genesis, right? We got the first two parshiot that deal with like the creation of the world through Noah. And then we've got from the third parsha, we've got Abraham. And basically the rest of the book of Bereshit is the story of 4 generations of the Jewish family. And then we've got Shmot, which is the description of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And pretty quickly we're to Mount Sinai. And then a lot of stuff happens at Mount Sinai. And then the entire book of Leviticus ostensibly is happening where? Still at Mount Sinai. Remember the second to last parsha, right? The double parsha at the end of Vayikra is Bahar Bechukotai. At the mountain. What's the mountain? Same mountain, right? We're not going anywhere. A lot of stuff happens at that mountain. In fact, all of the journeys, the 40 years of journey occur in the book of Bamidbar, right? In the wilderness. And in fact, a bunch of that is actually just the first 2 years because we don't even get to the story of the spies, right? That's year 2 or so. And then 38 years of Jewish history occur in like, I don't know, a bunch of chapters. And then we're at Devarim, and then we're standing on the banks of the Jordan River. And the entire book of Deuteronomy happens in one location as well, on the banks of the Jordan, overlooking the promised land. So we're still here at Mount Sinai. And if it wasn't clear that God is speaking only to Moshe, Rashi, the 11th century commentator, makes it clear. Why does the verse add the word elav? Seems redundant. God is speaking to Moses, and then it says elav, right? Why to him? It's pretty clear. So Rashi says this is intended to specifically exclude Aaron. That's the point. Rabbi Yehuda says, he brings from the Midrash, from Sifra, which is a halachic Midrash. There are 13 communications that they were spoken not to Aaron but to Moses only, with the view that he should communicate them to Aaron. And Rashi goes on to ask, I might, however, think that they, that is Aaron and all of Israel, heard at least the sound of the divine utterance, hadibur, even though they could not distinguish the words. However, writes Rashi, in the text in Numbers, chapter 7, it says, and he heard the voice uttering itself to him, same word, elav. Moses alone heard the utterance, he says, and all of Israel did not hear it. Okay, so that's what the Midrash says. And back to our parasha, Rashi says that the reason our verse in Vayikra says Me'ohel Moed, from the tent of meeting, because that also may seem a little extraneous, is that God's voice breaks off at the boundary of the tent of meeting. It's like speaking in a soundproof room with windows, right? And here we are looking in from the outside, and you might see that something is being said on the inside, but the sound is completely cut off from the outside observers. That's kind of what it was like, according to Rashi. And this tracks with Exodus chapter 7, before the plagues, when Moshe is concerned about his being inadequate to the task. Remember, he's going on and saying, it's kind of the second time he does this, first at the burning bush, and then later, God, I am not a man of words, I am arouse fatayim, I am a man of uncircumcised lips. And God kind of makes clear that there's going to be a hierarchy of revelation here. So God is going to speak to Moses, Moses to Aaron, Aaron to the others. Okay? See, I place you, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Re'ei natatich Elohim leFaro, V'Aaron achicha yeh neviecha. See, I place you in the role of God to Pharaoh, with your brother Aaron as your prophet. You shall repeat all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall speak to Pharaoh to let the Israelites depart from his land. But is the communication plan, I would ask you, always like a game of telephone? Is it always God to Moshe, Moshe to Aaron, Aaron to the people? And the answer is no. The Sifra, the Midrash I was citing earlier, also says that there are 13 communications in the Torah, according to the word of the text, that to have been spoken to Moses and Aaron together. And one of those moments seems to be specifically related to the Passover story. We read it last week on Shabbat HaChodesh, the special maftir that sets the calendar in motion. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month, HaChodesh Hazeh, shall mark for you the beginning of months. Speak to the whole community of Israel and say. Notice that the Lord said to Moses and Aaron. So here, just before the 10th plague and the Exodus itself, it's not Moses to Aaron and Aaron to the others. It's God to Moshe and Aaron, and then they somehow speak to the people. And then, of course, the question is, how does that happen? Right? How does part 2 of the revelation happen? And Rashi explains that in this case, with the first mitzvah related to the people, because Exodus 12 is the kind of formational moment of the nation of Israel, who are about to leave slavery and to head on their way to the promised land. In this particular case, because it's so special, Aaron has earned the right to participate fully, and then the problem is a technical one. How exactly did they speak together? And Rashi continues, and this is fascinating. I think the words emerged from between them as if they were both speaking. And according to the Midrash in Mechelta, each brother would honor the other by asking him questions and attempting to learn from him. Which brings us back to Pesach. Now, I said Pesach is fundamentally dialogical, so it makes sense that the part of the story before Sinai that deals with our people's foundational narrative would also place the leaders in a dialogical relationship. Pesach is all about democratizing ritual, right? It's a home-based holiday. I'll be in shul. I won't ask you to raise your hand if you plan to be in shul. We always have people in shul, and it's lovely. But the reason that Pesach is the number one observed Jewish holiday of all of them, right? More than Shabbos, more than Hanukkah. The reason that people do Pesach is because it's about the home. And not only is it about the home, but it's, right? So the Korban Pesach is eaten in the home. But also, it's about democratizing creativity. The Seder is pulsing with the creative energy. Raise your hand if you have special traditions in your home, family traditions that you do, that you've developed over time. Maybe you've added to them. Maybe you have certain melodies that you sing, or you put a bunch of tchotchkes on the table, or perhaps your Seder is always evolving. You're bringing new questions and new ideas. Maybe you read something in the news that you want to discuss at your Seder table this year. The Seder is all about creativity and the democratization of the ritual in the home. And the reason that it's interesting and the reason we keep coming back is because it is like an ever unfurling tradition. And I want to suggest that this is not an accident, that creativity, innovation, artistry, these are so often accessed from somewhere outside or beyond ourselves. There's something holy in the creative enterprise. Revelatory, in fact. I was listening recently to a discussion on a podcast with Malcolm Gladwell and Rick Rubin, the legendary record producer. And Rubin made the claim that art comes from a spiritual place, that it requires the artist to understand themselves as part of something larger. Not necessarily to be religious, but to understand themselves as part of something larger than them. Now, our Jewish tradition calls this the Ein Sof, the ineffable, the infinite. And the discussion was fascinating, but the upshot was that in an era of hypersensitivity to cultural appropriation, we've forgotten how to celebrate inspiration. That great art is always borrowed and repositioned and reimagined and recontextualized. The Beatles, said Rubin, were great because what they really wanted to do was play Motown. And the distillation of that approach to music through the particular genius of four guys from Liverpool gave birth to something wholly different and beautiful, which isn't to say that appropriation isn't real, right? Appropriation happens, but that happens when we're not honest about our muse, right? Or when resources are redirected away from those who equally or sometimes are more deserving of those resources. And our Jewish tradition actually is sensitive to that. We have this idea that credit should always be given where it's due, our sages were insistent that we cite our sources, that if we teach Torah, we do it b'shem omro, always in the name of the one from whom we learned it. Even if the Torah we teach is now fundamentally changed by distilling it through our own minds or our own voices. Tomorrow morning at 10:30, we'll have a chance to learn about some of these ideas from Dr. Josh Culp of the Conservative Yeshiva in Jerusalem, who's in Baltimore now, and he's going to be with us here at Beth Am at 10:30. And Dr. Culp has done a great deal of research about the evolution of the Seder and the ways that it borrows from earlier Greco-Roman modalities to form something unique but also ever evolving. But here, today, before we reenact the Exodus once again and make our way through the sea toward Mount Sinai, I want to offer us the following bracha. That we should never forget that Torah, at its best, is not simply inherited, not simply passed down from prophet to the people, or packaged from one generation to be delivered with a bow to the next. Torah is meant, in some very real way, to be co-created in each generation through the interplay of human beings, moved by its messages, uplifted by its mitzvot, and inspired by the infinite presence that animates it all. The Seder is dialogical, conversational, interactive, because redemption exists in the spaces between the notes of our tradition. And it exists also in the space between each of us. The Midrash says that Torah is black fire on white fire. It's that sort of dynamism that positions us to engage in the most holy of human endeavors, the most godly, creativity. That's what God does. God creates. God fashions the world so that we might do the same, bechol dor vador, in the language of the Haggadah, in each and every generation. Shabbat shalom.